All of our panelists have extensive bios. You can find those bios on our website, and also there should be copies here this morning for you as well. So our introductions will be very brief so we can get right to their testimony and questions from the task force members. First is Geoffrey Alpert, professor, University of South Carolina. Professor?
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioner Ramsey, Professor Robinson, Director Davis, members of the panel. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk on this incredibly important issue on use of force, research, and policies. I want to introduce a few topics and then some specific recommendations to address them. I do want to say, in the sense of an introduction, I started my police research career in Miami evaluating the events of the riots that took place after the covered-up death of Arthur McDuffie and several officer-involved shootings that initiated civil disturbance in Miami. I was asked by the Dade's chiefs of police to evaluate the after-action documents and write the after-action reports. It was a tough time for police community relations then in that city. And Dr. Alexander, I want to say I learned a great deal from Chief Flynn from Marietta. He's a wonderful guy and quite knowledgeable. He was a mentor at that time and still. During those evaluations, we learned a lot about healing. We learned a lot about building social capital in the community. But it seems like we're resetting the clock. And Professor Robinson, unlike a sports analogy, I'll use an animal analogy, it's like Groundhog Day. We seem to be repeating ourselves with some of the same issues, some of the same problems that we saw even back then. In terms of research, what we know about use of force, from many agencies, we get a wonderful worm's eye view. We are able to go into agencies, some of you chiefs allow us to look at your data, allow us to analyze the information from your department, and do our analyses and provide information on what's going on. But we always seem to focus on the events that fail. We always seem to focus on the encounters that fail because either the citizen is doing something in a way that requires police response, or the officer is scared and overreacts, or something happens that it fails. And I guess my first recommendation is to explore officer decision-making while we continue to look at the unsuccessful encounters that result in force. Let's also look at some of those that are successful. The decision-making officers make or do in these encounters that go beyond the force, are resolved in different ways, where officers have found different ways to resolve situations. And I guess in firefighter talk, it's the near miss. What have they done in a situation that has been successful? Now, when we look at these events, whether they're successful or unsuccessful, we also are trying to look at all sides of the corners. We want all four corners of the situation. We want to know information from everyone involved, everyone who's observed it, and obviously today, and I know you're going to hear about body-worn cameras, but we do have audio recordings, we do have video recordings. There's a lot of information to collect and to analyze and to interpret to determine what happened and why it happened. And again, without knowing about successful encounters, it's very hard to just without context, to look at these unsuccessful ones. So, unless, in some agencies, we don't even have the good worm's eye view because we don't have good information. But when complaints are filed or lawsuits are filed and the courts take over the investigations and we start seeing depositions, we start seeing legal documents, all of a sudden we see a picture that's painted perhaps differently than what we first thought. So recommendation 2 is to incorporate information discovered in litigation into what we know and what we do in developing policies, in training, in supervision, and accountability. Let me just read I pulled out some phrases that I got from depositions the other day where officers were justifying use of force and even deadly force. And I'm quoting, "I felt threatened. I was in imminent fear of my life. The suspect made furtive movements. The suspect exhibited superhuman strength. He reached for his waistband. He reached under his seat. So my third recommendation is that policies must require reports to be limited to facts and observations and not include language that's conclusory. What did this person do that threatened you? What exactly did this person do that put you in imminent fear of your life? We need to know that. We need to know what happened. And I think we need to know why they felt threatened and why they used force to resolve the situation, or what other options were available. And I think that it goes beyond just the final frame to the tactics, what was done prior to the final frame. And once we begin to collect this information, my fourth recommendation is for departments to create what we call the force factor, or a relative measure of force. So we don't just see what the officer did, we see what the officer did in relationship to what the suspect did. And this is simply a number subtracting one from the other. And when we have a numerical description of what happened, it identifies situations that are disproportionate. And those disproportionate, perhaps more force than necessary or less force than reasonable, can be looked at and analyzed, and can be analyzed by agency, by ethnicity of either party or all parties, by other variables, including places, level of violence, level of violent crime. There are all sorts of ways to look at these things. And recommendation 5 is that we use this information in what's called officer-created jeopardy training. And I recall Chief Michael Burko from Savannah, Georgia, creating this program down there where he brought in officers who had made mistakes and were willing to talk about it. He brought in officers who did really well and figured out alternatives to use of force and alternatives to deadly force, and explained to his fellow officers or her fellow officers what happened, how he or she was able to make those decisions. The sessions included good news and bad news, but they were informative in explaining how decisions are to be made. Recommendation 6 kind of comes back full cycle to we need a bird's eye view of use of force and deadly force in this country. Many of you sitting up there who control data have invited us in and allow us to come in. We get a great view, but there's so many departments in this country who don't, and chiefs who don't invite us in, who don't know and don't give us the bird's eye view. And I think the point here is we keep statistics on so many aspects of our lives. The government keeps statistics. In a world we live in today, we don't keep information on this highest level of government intrusion. And I think it's a real national embarrassment that we don't have a clear picture of police use of force or deadly force. And hopefully this task force will move in that direction. In closing, I want to say that the Death in Custody Reporting Act, which was signed into law in December, and the recently introduced National Statistics on Deadly Force Transparency Act, if signed into law together, will really give us a good view of deadly force. But I think it's just as important that we understand the different aspects of lesser lethal force as well as deadly force. And my colleague, Chief Jeff Noble, summed up our predicament by questioning the lack of meaningful accountability to protect the civil liberties of the consumers of police services, while the government spends so aggressively to protect the American consumer from the free market. I think we need to change that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Next, we'll hear from Michael McHale, the President of the National Association of Police Organizations, NAPO.
Mr. Chairman, before you proceed forward, may I ask the speakers, could you bring the mic closer to you? And if I can ask the audio people to turn off the echoing that goes with it, go back to the flat, we'll just bring the mics closer. Sorry for the interruption, Mr. McHale, but we sure we can hear you, sir.
No problem, sir. Thank you. Commissioner Ramsey, Professor Robinson, and members of the task force on 21st Century Policing. Thank you for inviting me to speak today at the second public listening session. My name is Michael McHale. I am an active duty canine sergeant with the Sarasota Police Department. I also serve as the president of the National Association of Police Organizations, NAPO. I am here today to testify on behalf of NAPO's members. NAPO represents over 241,000 sworn law enforcement officers from across the country. These officers work tirelessly to keep our communities safe. We urge the task force to strongly consider the views of our members, rank and file police officers, who have firsthand knowledge of these issues that are being considered. Moreover, our members have the greatest stake in the outcomes of the task force, both as public safety officers who are responsible for carrying out the law and as citizens of communities that will be impacted by new policies on public safety. I have been asked to use my allotted time to discuss our views on use of force policies. To frame this issue, it must be noted that another layer of risk has been added to an already dangerous job. Individuals are increasingly willing to harm law enforcement officers. Social media and news outlets have perpetuated an environment of extreme hostility in communities across our nations. Pundits continue to mischaracterize law enforcement as agitators and harassers, when the fact is that police officers choose a career to serve their communities and protect our citizens. The inflammatory rhetoric culminated in murder just months ago, when two of our member officers, New York City Police Department officers Wenjin Liu and Officer Rafael Ramos, were deliberately assassinated in the line of duty. As an officer and as the voice of hundreds of thousands of officers, I can adamantly say that no officer wants to use force while on duty. It is the police who try to save lives and protect people from injury. The officer does not want to hurt the suspect. The officer wants to help stop crime. That being said, officers are trained to use force if necessary, not only to enforce the law, but to defend themselves and protect other citizens in dangerous situations. For these reasons, federal and state laws recognize an officer's right to use force. We fully understand and support investigation of officers who must resort to the use of deadly force to protect themselves and their communities. However, we believe it is only right that the officer be investigated by someone who is unbiased and not subject to political pressures. The investigator should have an understanding of an officer's duties and be absolutely impartial throughout an investigation. However, in any investigation of an officer's use of force must include an evaluation of the officer's knowledge and beliefs. This is a constitutional standard recognized by the U.S. Supreme Court in Graham versus Connor, not a local standard. The Supreme Court has ruled that the most important factor to consider in evaluating use of force incidents is the threat reasonably believed to be faced by the officer at the time of the incident. Therefore, utilizing an outside agency or relying on special prosecutors with little or no experience of the actual circumstances and locations involved risks depriving the investigation of those significant facts which only the local agency may know. Building on this, we are concerned with the trend of calling on outside entities to intervene on use of force cases when the public disagrees with the decision of an officer's use of force. The recent case in Ferguson, Missouri is a prime example of this issue. The investigation involved many parties, including the local police department, the state police, the St. Louis County Police Department, the governor's office, the prosecuting attorney, the Department of Justice, United States Attorney's Office, the local grand jury, the Federal Civil Rights Division, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. After a thorough investigation involving all of the aforementioned parties, the grand jury concluded that no criminal action took place. But many deemed that this was not enough and demanded another level of investigation. We strongly believe that it would be a mistake to add in yet another level of bureaucracy based on political considerations whenever one part of the public disagrees with a legally correct and unbiased decision. We expect our officers to offer every citizen respect, dignity, compassion, and fairness. Officers are expected to enforce the law strictly based on the law, not based on politics, gender, or race. This is a standard we expect from all of our officers and a standard that our officers uphold. We strongly feel they should receive the same treatment when they are being investigated. In light of these facts, we have several recommendations that we urge you to strongly consider. First, we must work together to better educate the public about the role and rights of police officers in enforcing the law, including the right to defend themselves and innocent bystanders. Second, it is vital that political leaders publicly support grand jurors and other public officials when they make correct but unpopular decisions applying the law to the evidence. Finally, as our officers work to engage citizens through community policing efforts, we feel that it would be beneficial to encourage citizens to go on ride-alongs, participate in civilian police academies, try shoot, don't shoot simulators, and explore other opportunities to increase their understanding of law enforcement's mission. These interactions will allow citizens the opportunity to understand a police officer's duty and ultimate goal of keeping our communities safe. I appreciate the opportunity to convey these thoughts to you and hope you will consider our perspective moving forward. I look forward to answering any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we will hear from Harold Medlock, Chief of the Fayetteville Police Department.
Good morning, Director Davis, Professor Robinson, and Commissioner Ramsey, and members of the Commission. Thank you for allowing me to be here today. I'm truly humbled to have this opportunity. The use of force by police officers is the most controversial and misunderstood issue by the citizens we serve and today's law enforcement professional. Many citizens believe that all interactions with police should be peaceful, and when not, are the result of police overreaction to the situation. Police officers attempt to follow guidelines regarding use of force and then often feel that the necessary use of force subjects them to extreme scrutiny of police administrators and the public. The understanding and application of use of force and deadly use of force must involve police officers, police administrators, and the public in determining policy and training. Use of force training and policy must be developed based upon the most current techniques, technology, and equipment. Constant citizen input and interaction is critical in helping communities understand the whys and hows of use of force. Police organizations must treat their use of force policy as a living document that is refined and adjusted according to incidents which occur in their own jurisdiction as well as those which occur nationwide. They must be willing to refine their policy and identify necessary training immediately. To build and maintain trust, police leaders must provide timely and accurate information to the public and acknowledge issues or problems with a specific use of force while protecting the rights of the officers involved. Use of force continuum policies and training must be easy for officers to understand and apply during stressful situations and should address how force can be escalated and de-escalated according to a given situation. Having separate use of force policies for non-deadly and deadly use of force is advisable for ease of understanding, while also acknowledging that the two deadly and non-deadly uses of force, the two policies may be intertwined in one situation. Seeking assistance, this is a plug, Director, seeking assistance from the DOJ COPS Office for the collaborative reform process in use of force policy and training review recommendations, and the BJA OJP Diagnostic Center for Understanding Crime and Relationship with the Community is essential. In many cases, simply applying many of the lessons learned and recommendations from cities who have undergone such processes will provide police leaders with the necessary tools and understanding the issues at hand. Use of force policies must have more than one extremely long and difficult policy for officers to navigate. Having use of force policies divided, for example, into three specific areas, such as the use of non-deadly and less lethal force, conducted electric weapon or the taser use and care, and then deadly force, provides officers a quick reference. It also allows the community to better understand where the force stands in policies. And in every use of force policy, a sanctity of life statement should be included that acknowledges the protection and reverence for human life should be paramount in every officer's mind. Problems with state post and BLET training often conflict with local training. State training often lags behind the local department's training and techniques, but it is still required for officers to go through basic law enforcement training and recertification every year. Training such as, or policies that certain states have, and I'll speak specifically to North Carolina, something called a stun strike, which is a strike to the head. To stun an individual to gain compliance is old. it's far past its usefulness, and certainly something that we in our department choose not to employ. Having a high emphasis by departments on physical skills and a low emphasis on de-escalation skills contribute to problems with the community, understanding our use of force policies and practices. Departments must agree to enhance their training in reality-based training, crisis intervention training, fair and impartial policing, surviving verbal conflict, training at the speed of life, to help them better react to situations and be able to articulate why they did what they did in a given situation. Creating a chain of command review board, which includes a civilian person, usually from a CRB, a Community Relations Board or Human Relations Board from the city of the respective department. Having them as a voting member of the board certainly opens that process up to allow folks to feel better that the process is fair and impartial. And then creating a policy, as Mr. Alpert, or Professor Alpert said earlier, of having constant video and audio recordings until the video body cameras are in place through DMVR activation of every officer encounter certainly helps document those issues that officers confront on the street. And then finally, policy oversight commissions or panels can be a good thing, provided that they are developed in collaboration with the community, the police leadership, and police rank and file. These commissions must be non-political. They must not appear to be pro-police in its makeup, and information presented to the board should be confidential, but findings should be made public. And perhaps general uniform standards or guidelines should be adopted at the state level to provide trust in the system from community to community. I look forward to answering any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final panelist will be Rashad Robinson, Executive Director, Color of Change.
Greetings, esteemed panelists, commissioners, and colleagues. I'm honored to be here. In such a historic time of mass participation, we have an incredible opportunity to right one of America's greatest wrongs. The problems before us are not new, and the road before us is long. But with the solid commitment to address police misconduct and restore integrity and confidence in our criminal justice system, I know that we can get there. On behalf of the more than 1 million Color of Change members nationwide, I thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this critical process. I also want to applaud and recognize the important steps that the President and Department of Justice have taken in recent months in regard to police reform. The tragic killing of Michael Brown by Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson has sparked a new and growing racial justice movement. More than 170 days later, courageous Black youth and Americans of all walks of life are still risking their lives and liberty to demand a more just America, where law enforcement honors the right and dignity of all communities. We come here today embroiled in what can only be described as a national crisis of discriminatory police violence and a fundamental failure in our justice system. Millions nationwide doubt and mistrust law enforcement, as well as the ability of local, state, and federal prosecutors to investigate and hold individual officers accountable. We need to restore this trust in order to advance the structural changes to police departments to keep all of our communities safe. As I hear often from our members, Black and brown people in cities across America face the very real threat that they or one of their loved ones will be unjustly stopped, assaulted, or killed by law enforcement. The problems of policing are many, from the failed practice of stop and frisk and broken windows policing, which institutionalizes racial profiling, to sexual abuse, illegal surveillance, unjust arrests, the killing of civilians, and mass incarceration. Misconduct and racial bias are embedded in many police practices and structures, with largely no effective and independent oversight or accountability. In order to create and enforce a higher standard of policing nationwide, we come here to offer a few reforms. Civilian oversight. We urge the expansion of a strong, empowered state and local level civilian control over law enforcement nationwide. There's been much research done into the criteria of effective civilian oversight boards, but general guidelines include strong political and public support, police cooperation, a proactive approach to identify underlying systemic problems with police, and the comprehensive legal power to resolve said issues, as well as control over more than police misconduct, but hiring and firing, policing priorities, and participatory budgeting as well. We suggest that funding, in part for this expansion and control, come from the termination of many of the federal anti-drug grants. Influence of police culture. We urge the divestment of federal funding from police departments that demonstrate abuse of power and discriminatory policing, and the reinvestment of said funds into community-controlled policing and policing alternatives. Endemic to policing departments across the country is oftentimes a culture of secrecy, impunity, profit-driven policing, violence, and racial bias. Police unions sometimes play a large role in perpetuating the culture and maintaining a dangerous divide between law enforcement and common sense policing reform. The divestment of federal funds from law enforcement and subsequent reinvestment in civilian oversight and social services, such as mental health care and others, are proven to keep communities safe and has potential to realign policing culture and priorities towards transparency, public accountability, racial equity, and public safety. Disciplinary systems. We urge the mandating of peace officer standards and training commissions in every state, as well as the inter- and intrastate coordination between all post commissions. Law enforcement is one of the few professions without a regulated statewide board in every state that is able to suspend or remove police officers' license or certifications. Only 43 states have posts that are able to revoke an officer's license, and there is no streamlined system that allows for communication between posts to prevent the rehiring of abusive police officers across state lines and city lines. Use of force. We also urge the national use of force matrix and a mandate that state and local police have clear and streamlined matrices. A number of localities already use discipline matrices to create uniform mechanisms of accountability. In combination with effective enforcement and community oversight of law enforcement, federal streamlined matrices would be a significant step in the right direction for setting and enforcing a higher standard of police conduct. Regarding the mass demonstrations, free speech, and the use of military equipment, we urge an end to the 1033 program and similar federal initiatives that fuel police militarization. The latest action by Attorney General Holder was a major step in the right direction, as well as the White House's review of the program. But it is our view that both initiatives didn't go far enough. The militarization of police brought about the discriminatory and failed war of drugs, which has consistently and systematically violated the First and Fourth Amendment rights of so many of our citizens. Civil rights enforcement. We urge the President to pass an executive order that reinforces and expands the civil rights law and bans on discriminatory violent policing. There are plenty of civil rights laws on the books that if enforced, we could hold law enforcement officers, hold officers and police departments accountable for discrimination and unjust violence. But the enforcement is not up to speed with the scale and size of the problem at hand. And research and data collection. We urge the White House and the Department of Justice to move forward with a national database on police use of force. As of today, such a database does not exist. Although recent congressional action and leadership from Attorney General signals renewed commitment, we cannot afford to wait another 2 or 3 years for this critical information that will allow federal officials to identify patterns of misconduct, hold individual officers and departments accountable when necessary, address the policies that incentivize police brutality, and implement reforms that allow law enforcement to do their job while respecting the lives and dignity of all communities. I welcome the opportunity to work more closely with the administration in moving these policies forward. I stand with the more than 1 million Color of Change members to continue to raise our voices on these issues all around the country and look forward to the discussion ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank all of you for your testimony. At this point, we will turn to task force members for their questions, beginning with Tracy Mears, who will be followed by Sean Smoot.
Good morning, and thank you so much for your testimony. I have questions for Professor Alpert and Sergeant McHale, and the questions actually take the form of having you offer some comment on the testimony of your fellow panelists. So first, for you, Professor Alpert, in his written testimony, Sergeant McHale said, and I quote, "Individuals are increasingly willing to harm law enforcement officers," end quote. I'm curious about your view of that statement, specifically what in your view are the data that would support that statement, that officers are increasingly at risk from individuals who are willing to harm them? And second, if you don't think that the data do support that statement, what activities present the largest risk of harm to officers on the job? Because I think that's relevant to the idea that, that Graham versus Connor says, that police officers' use of force is responsible to the reasonable belief of their risk of harm. So that's the question for you. And for you, Sergeant McHale, Mr. Robinson recommends mandatory post standards in every state and a national database. I'm just wondering what the view is of the folks you represent about ideas like that. And Chief Medlock says there's research that shows more education leads to less force, and I would like to hear you comment on those ideas.
Professor?
Well, thank you for the softball. Appreciate it. I think there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that citizens are extremely violent and have increased violence. A lot of the officers I talk with, a lot of the research I look at from the qualitative side does show that there's I mean, certainly don't want to get back to the old super predator kind of thought, but there certainly are some people out there who are willing to do anything to continue their crimes and continue their behavior. I don't think we've seen good empirical research on that. I don't think we know in the aggregate what's going on. We certainly know, and again, some worms I've used, some departments have come out with information on high levels of either resistance or what we're talking about is this, we'll do anything to continue what's going on. Well, I forgot the second part.
The second is, if the data don't support that there's an increasing risk at the hands of individuals, what activities on the job actually do present the greatest risk of harm to officers in your view, or what does the research show?
Well, I think that you know, as a researcher, of course, my answer is going to be we need to do more research. But I think that we do need to find out what is going on with the majority of people. We know the small number, as I mentioned before, anecdotally, are extremely violent. Our research has shown that if we look at calls for service, it's almost a preparation. For example, when officers go into a very volatile situation, such as a domestic, they seem to be prepared, and the levels of force, the numbers of uses of force seem to have declined because of the preparation going into these high-risk environments. The violence seems to occur, I don't want to say randomly because we don't know that either, but it seems to occur in situations where officers aren't prepared, aren't ready to go and face a situation such as a domestic where there's always potential. So I think it's looking at the CAD data, looking at the information on calls for service, looking where the use of force ends up being part of the encounter, and trying to figure out which calls, which areas, which people are going to be the biggest threat.
In the first question, we already represent many states that have in place commissions that set up the standards and training and acceptable behavior of the law enforcement officers that are involved. For myself personally, I sat as a commissioner in the state of Florida for 6 years and have personally recommended and terminated the ability for law enforcement officers to continue in their profession in our state based upon cases that were presented to our commission. So I would wait to see what the recommendation is on a national level and have a better opportunity to give our opinion and my opinion on the first part of your question. And if you, again, if you could help me with the
The
second.
second part is, what's your view on Chief Medlock's idea about the research showing that more educated officers use less force?
I would respectfully request to be provided with that information and be able to give a better response upon reading that. We represent officers who have obtained a high school diploma and/or GED up to and including master's degree. So depending upon the situation at hand, I would be in a better position to give a response if I was able to read that documentation.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Sean Smoot, followed by Sue Rohr.
Thank you, Chairman Ramsey. And I'd like to thank the panel for, all of the panel for your testimony this morning. My question is directed at the panel, but I suspect that Professor Alpert and Chief Medlock may be the chief responders, because your testimony touched on this. I'm a little curious about lack of a recommendation or really any testimony about non-adversarial, non-blaming use of force review systems. And in particular, we know, we've looked at, in the medical field, you know, they do sentinel event reviews. In aviation, they do sentinel event reviews. And, you know, in firefighters, somebody testified, I heard the words near miss. I think it was you, Professor. You know, the firefighters have a national database where they collect data on near miss situations that can be shared, and it's not information that's used in an adversarial process. And so I'd be curious to know if that's something you would recommend.
Chief, you want to go?
Sure. I think it's a great idea. However, we have to get our officers beyond the criminal investigation, because there is a criminal investigation particularly in a deadly use of force. We have to get the officer beyond the internal investigation, which in some cases is more rigorous than the criminal investigation. And now we're asking them to enter into this non-adversarial position. I think it's a great idea. But in every one of those cases, that appears to me, at least the experience I have, that would occur after these other two processes occur, which both take some time to complete. And by the time they are, whether the officer is right or wrong, feelings are hurt. There's mistrust on the part of the officer. There's probably mistrust on the part of the community. And in some cases, there may be mistrust on the part of the police administration. So if the process could be set up correctly, I think it's a very good idea. It's something certainly that we could learn from. We, police officers, and I just want to share this, police officers have the websites that show the video cameras, camera captures of near deadly force and deadly force encounters where the officer is right. But rarely do any of those websites produce the footage where the officer may be on the edge or may be wrong. And so we have to get to the point of everybody stepping back and saying, we finished these two processes, and now we need to enter into this process to truly learn from it and see how we can protect the community and the officers going forward.
Thank you very much. Sue Rohr, followed by Jose Lopez.
I think the professor wanted to respond.
Oh, I'm sorry. Professor?
That's fine. I just wanted to follow up. The officer-created jeopardy training I mentioned does that. It gives, if the officer's willing to come in and talk to his fellow officers or her fellow officers about what decisions were made, what happened, what the interaction was, it is non-judgmental, it's non-blaming, and I've sat through these training sessions and incredibly impressed with the openness and the willingness of officers to share their views with their fellow officers about what they did right, what they did wrong in a training scenario. So I think rather than talk about who's at fault, it was more how I responded or what happened and how I thought about this, what I saw, how I interpret it. Sometimes with videos you can look at things and the officer may be technically wrong but emotionally correct. So I think it's an absolutely great idea. I think, as the Chief was saying, there have to be some protections, but that's the way officers are going to learn.
Okay, Sue?
Professor Alpert, I'll start with you. There's been a lot of talk about gathering data so we can examine use of force, and I really appreciate your perspective about looking at both the good and the bad. So I think we can learn as much from how it's done right as from wrong. What I'm interested in is how we go about gathering that data in a way that we can actually analyze it for trends and things like that. And I would be curious to know, you described what sounds like data mining out of litigation, which I know there's a depth of information there, but it's very time-consuming. I'm wondering if you're aware of any states or any entities that have a prescribed set of questions that is asked on every use of force so that you can actually compare the same question without having to mine it out of somewhere. And what do you think of that methodology? Would that be helpful?
Okay, first one was, first question.
Are you aware of any efforts where there's a prescribed set of questions?
That was the second question.
Okay. I think the first part was just a little sermon.
Okay. No, I thought there was an issue, and I was going to write, but I wanted to listen to your second question. Reading a lot of these depositions in litigation, and several of you are lawyers and have conducted them yourselves, you always ask questions about now the Graham factors. You always ask questions about what did you know, what do you remember about policy, what do you remember about your training, and sometimes it's embarrassing what officers don't remember, what officers forget, or sometimes we see lawsuits that officers file against their departments for failure to train. So I think there's an enormous amount of information. I think some of the software that is being developed, the qualitative research software, can go through and find keywords that will bring this out so you don't have to spend the hours and hours. But you know what? In the law firm, someone's reading that, the experts are reading it. There's an enormous amount of information that I think can help a department when it gets sued to understand where its shortcomings are and how to improve. Maybe it comes back to Mr. Smoot's question about the non-blaming reviews. I mean, here's a situation where obviously there's a lawsuit and there's going to be blame and there's going to be perhaps liability, but there's so much information that then gets thrown away. And I think it needs to be recycled back into the administration. They need to pay attention to the information from the lawsuits.
Going back to, though, having a prescribed set of questions, and I guess I would ask Chief Medlock as well, the positives and negatives of going into looking at every use of force, whether positive or negative, you're answering the same questions about the same data.
Well, the internal affairs investigations are going to have those questions too. And we see similar questions all the time from the internal affairs side of it. I think the litigation side is aimed a little different, but they're just a whole, I mean, I've seen the model questions, and I don't remember where they're from, but they all relate to, what the officer was thinking in relationship to some of these Graham factors in terms of use of force, and then, of course, the policy training and accountability. There are model questions. I think they're more set up for internal affairs than the litigation.
Chief Medlock, any?
Well, I just think that certainly it's a good idea to have that set of questions to collect some data. But I'm wondering if the cities would allow that. In other words, with all due respect to the attorneys in the room, I failed to mention the third most important is the civil litigation that occurs after all of this. So under what circumstances can we provide that information timely while the criminal, the civil, and the internal investigations and processes are ongoing? If there were a way to develop that understanding, to call almost a timeout for this issue, perhaps we could get some meaningful, timely information that researchers could provide us the data to learn from.
Mr. Robinson or Sergeant McHale, your thoughts?
Your first question did have to do with something really important. I just remembered it. It was the positive encounters. We've set up, first of all, there's a precedent. We've done this with pursuits. We've done it where officers are filling out forms when they could pursue, but they don't. And we've piloted a few minor projects where we've had officers fill out the quote, near miss, sort of the firefighter's example, but where they resolve situations and de-escalated and explain why. And I think, I know paperwork is not the favorite thing for police to do, but in some of these areas, it's such a critical incident that we need to learn more about it. So I think doing some work on how people resolve situations without force, where force could have been used, is a really important thing to do.
Thank you very much. Jose Lopez, followed by Cedric Alexander.
Great, thank you. So I have questions for Mr. Alpert and also Mr. Robinson. Start with Mr. Alpert. In your testimony submitted, you say that you have read thousands of reports that discuss what officers face and how they have responded. And I'm just curious, based on your review of those reports, to what extent do factors such as racial assumptions from the perspective of the police officer enter into his or her decision to use force and then apply a certain severity of force?
Well, to answer your question, I have absolutely no idea, because I don't think I've read one report where there was an indication that race was a factor. Now, when you start looking at the data, you can statistically determine if race is a factor in the outcome, but your question was more motive, and no idea.
So another question for you, Mr. Alpert. So for recommendation 5, it was actually the first time that I have heard of this idea of agencies creating a force factor. And so, I mean, I just have to say, in reviewing this part of your testimony, that I am a little bit skeptical of any measurements that are solely defined by the police officer. And I'm wondering how this actually is calculated in practice, and if there are ways in which the creation of this force factor or this tool could be misused.
Well, we rely, I think, a large number of our research projects rely on police reports. We sometimes have the privilege of reading suspects, and sometimes we interview suspects about a particular incident and interview the officer and get both. Sometimes we get independent witnesses, but for the most part, our data come from the official police reports. And they do provide whatever they did, which relates to the use of force continuum, and yes, there's a number. They also provide what the suspect did in terms of resistance, and that also refers, for the most part, to a use of force continuum, and there's a number. So you read these all the time, and you see what the officer did, you see what the suspect did, but oftentimes in yearly reports, you just see what levels of force the officer used. And my point is that the level of force the officer used without context is not helpful. You need to understand the level of force and even the type of force an officer used in context to what the suspect did. So I think looking at that relative measure, and it's not an end-all, it's a beginning. If you see a disproportionate use of force, there may be training issues that the officer didn't use enough force, or there may be training issues the officer used too much force, but the disproportionate ones are the red flags.
I have some follow-up, but I'll move to the last question for Mr. Robinson. So in Mr. McHale's testimony, he talks about, or he says, we believe it is only right that the officer be investigated by someone who is unbiased and not subject to political pressures. And I know that one of the conversations across cities, states, and across the country is exactly that local district attorneys and local jurisdictions are seen as biased because of the day-to-day interactions that they have to have with the local precincts who patrol their jurisdiction. And so I want you to maybe unpack that a little bit for us and maybe talk to the national call for a special independent prosecutor and why that's important.
Absolutely. And I want to say that I agree with Mr. McHale that we all want these investigations to be independent, to not be subject to the type of politics that don't get us the correct results. And in fact, I hear every single day from my members, not just about the fact that they want to be able to trust law enforcement, but many times they're calling on law enforcement during really tough and challenging times in our communities, and they need law enforcement to respond. And when we don't trust law enforcement, when we don't believe that there's going to be the type of oversight and accountability necessary, people don't call law enforcement when they actually need them, and that's also challenging. Part of what we're calling for here is the type of investigation that we think will get results, that will help bring our communities closer together, that will help law enforcement and community work. And so this call, in terms of special prosecutors, helps to create the type of incentive for us to get real results. Time and time again, as we see around the country, there is no political incentive for prosecutors who have to work with police every single day, who have to stand for election, to go the full mile. And even when they do go the full mile, there is the cloud that hangs over the head of the investigation of whether or not it was fair or not. In order for us to sort of end this cloud that sometimes exists in these situations, or the very real factor that in many of these instances we learn later that the investigation wasn't full, that facts were hidden, that the grand juries that were done were not sort of in line with other grand juries. We saw this in Ferguson. We've seen this in Staten Island, where somehow these grand juries look different than hundreds of other grand juries that took place in the same jurisdiction. This call is to start bringing more transparency and more light to the process so our communities can trust what's happening, and that police will be able to start getting the benefit of the doubt in these situations from the community as well.
Any additional follow-up? Okay. Thank you. Cedric Alexander, followed by Brian Stevenson.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Alpert, for opening up in your opening remarks, going back to Dade County 1980. Because in light of everything that's occurring, if we go back there, and I was there along with who was Major Flynn at that time, Chief Flynn today, and Marietta, and it's funny, he and I just had this conversation several weeks ago. But if you know dating back at that time, just a little history for those who may not remember, those unfortunate incidents where those 4 officers were acquitted for beating to death or being accused of beating to death an unarmed motorcyclist during that time, which triggered a riot in that community that was ended up in a lot of deaths and a lot of property damage as well too. And we don't hear much about the McDuffie riots anymore. But equally important to that I often keep in mind too, is that we have a whole generation of young people, police officers if you will, who were not even born during that time. And even if we think about the Rodney King riots, we got a generation of police officers out here that were not even born during that time as well too. We have come a long way in policing, and certainly Dade County has, and I can attest to that because I grew up in that department. But I think that being said, a lot of what we were struggling with then, we find ourselves still struggling with today. And I am very optimistic at the end of this task force review that our recommendations are going to be something I truly believe is going to affect change as it relates to law enforcement in this country. Now, that being said, let me get to the crux of the questions that I have here, and one that is very important. And I want to ask Sergeant McHale, let me say this, Sergeant. In regards to your remarks in your position and around your constituents and colleagues, I think that is very admirable. I've been in policing a very long time, as you have, as many of us have. And one thing that we want to do, I think it's very important that our police officers feel supported. And you certainly have demonstrated that support of your constituents and even those that are not your constituents. who are in policing across this country as well, too. And so I applaud those remarks and your leadership around that. But one thing that I want some clarification on from you that I think is very, very important because of the constituents that you represent is going back to your remarks my colleague here just spoke about, where you're saying we fully understand and support investigations of officers who must resort to the use of deadly force to protect themselves and their community. However, we believe it is only right officers be investigated by someone who is unbiased and not subject to political pressures. I wholeheartedly agree. But here's the bigger question, if you will, is who is the persons who are not going to be politically influenced? Because there is a population of people in this country, a huge population of people in this country, who believe that police cannot investigate themselves. So you take a police-involved shooting, there are people who believe that internal affairs will do an unbiased job, that your police shoot team will do an unbiased job because people know each other, they go up in the department with each other, and the camaraderie that exists. We're always challenged by that. I know and you know that is not always true, but there is a real perception of that. So based on that, do you think, and I need this as a recommendation, and I certainly need to hear this from you, who are going to be those unbiased persons? Because if we have a community, which we all serve, who are saying that I don't feel comfortable with police investigating themselves, and in a police-involved shooting, particularly those that result in death, then do we go outside for those preliminary investigations, even when it comes to the district attorney of your respective community? Do we send that to an outside district attorney who does not work closely with that police agency? And you know, how do we begin to answer that question? Because you're right, police officers need fair and impartial justice as it relates to their interaction that may be deadly. But I think you would also agree, too, that the community, in their interests, deserves the same type of sense of fairness and an unbiased as well. So what would be your recommendation as to how we get there, and how do you think that should look?
Thank you. I believe it's a combination of all the above. There are, as you know, many, many districts and agencies that do not conduct investigations of their own officer-involved shootings. They don't have the ability to conduct a thorough investigation, maybe based upon the size and the makeup of their investigators. In those situations, it is understood. My comments were the concern of when special prosecutors are developed, the ability of those prosecutors, or the willingness of those prosecutors, to come into these investigations and maintain the focus at hand, that being the investigation they are investigating. We have concerns of a special prosecutor being concerned about continuing the ability of their existence. So again, not trying to minimize your question, sir, I think that the data that exists currently, where smaller agencies, in some cases larger agencies, either internally investigate their officer-involved shooting, use of force, deadly force, and in areas where they investigate themselves and have someone else be brought in, a recommendation of review of those cases and results, and come up with a reasonable expectation. I think it's paramount that the public be made aware immediately when these incidents occur, the confidence that there will be a thorough investigation. The investigation will be conducted, and there's an oversight on the results of this investigation. As I stated in my report earlier, you know, I don't want to characterize the entire nation on one incident. You're right, sir. You have been serving, and many people on this panel have served in this capacity, either directly as a law enforcement officer or someone who oversees the actions and responsibilities of our profession. So I don't believe that there's one particular setup of rules and instructions that could cover each and every circumstance. And before I conclude, I apologize, but I'd like to address a concern on the education factor. I would not disagree with the chief making his representation of the ability to show that in some instances, better educated officers make better decisions. My concern, quite frankly, is if we truly are going to embrace community-based policing and represent our agencies and departments of the makeup of those involved, we have to look into the makeup to include the ability of certain individuals, did they or did they not have an opportunity to obtain an education. And merely creating an environment of 60 credit hours or a 2-year degree, 4-year degree as the bottom line basis for hiring those officers, I think we're missing out on a greater part of the population that could come into this profession, be educated properly, and serve a lifelong commitment to the community without ever having their ability to be questioned.
Okay, so I'm still going to go back to my question. Sure. So let me reframe it very quickly here in the interest of time. So would you conclude that there needs to be outside investigators involved of police shooting, or should this continue to be done internally by police, where there is across this country small departments, mediocre size, large departments, and I've been hearing it for over 30 years of my career? Can police investigate themselves? That's the crux of a lot of this. And I like to think that they can. In my agency, I feel that we do, and we do a very good job of it. But it's not my thought. I'm thinking how the community may perceive this in many places across the country. I think I hear you saying there is no one specific answer to it. But I think what we have to, what I like to hear recommended by someone is how do we get there, and what does that look like where it feels very fair for police and it's very fair for community, because both entities have to feel a sense of fairness and balance around those investigations. The other piece I want to talk about, since you mentioned it around the education piece, I will agree with you. But the most important thing is that we have well-trained police officers, regardless of what their educational status may be, because you're right, there may be some who may not have the opportunity to afford college, or maybe they have military experience, whatever the case may happen to be. But our selection from the onset, the day that we select who's going to go to our academies, we got to look at that more intently as well, too. And one thing, I'll say this and I'll close. As it relates to police officers and threats in this country, I believe last year the FBI submitted a study that there is an uptick in threats towards police officers in this country, and I think we need to go back and review that. So we don't want to minimize that piece as well, too, because that was, if I'm not mistaken, published by the FBI at the end of last year. Thank you all very much, and thank you, sir.
Thank you. Brian Stevenson, followed by Roberto Villasenor.
Just 2 quick questions. Mr. Robinson, today, and actually at our initial hearing, we heard calls for increased community involvement in programs like ride-alongs and these shoot, no shoot scenarios. I'd be interested in your opinion about the interest among, say, your membership and the utility of that kind of effort, and just your general response to where you want to prioritize that in the reforms that you seek. And then my question, Mr. McHale, is for you. You talked about the challenges of these investigations, and I guess I'd just like your comment in response to this issue. So there are different kinds of consequences for use of force, and the police department may be evaluating whether the police officer followed department policy, which is a different kind of investigation because it doesn't implicate whether a crime was committed or even whether a civil rights violation was committed. Then there's this question of whether someone engaged in criminal misconduct, which is a second separate investigation. And then oftentimes civil rights issues are not implicated by whether there's a crime or even a departmental policy violation, but there's another set of concerns. I want to know whether you think it's appropriate that we're investigating all of these kinds of issues, and whether it's necessary that we have different entities investigating different questions, and how we resolve the point you made about minimizing investigations from multiple points with these three different concerns that are, and whether they're legitimate concerns.
Again, I believe on each investigation upon the circumstances that is before the individual agency and/or investigators, that all three of those subjects can be covered. We have, it's not an issue of the simplicity of what the actions were. Most of our agencies that we represent and our statewide federal officers in this and agents in this profession are governed by rules and regulations that supersede the law. In other words, you may not have violated the law, but your code of conduct is unacceptable, and there are penalties that are associated with that. Many of the labor organizations that represent men and women of law enforcement choose not to defend these actions when it is clearly provided that the actions that the officers have taken were not in the scope of their employment. So there is a separation. And again, I believe it's on a case-by-case basis as it is presented to the investigators at hand. And once again, to Mr. Alexander's comment, yes, I believe in areas where there has been successful investigation, a continuous investigation, where the administrators of that respective agency could show the experience and quality of the individuals that are charged and tasked with those responsibilities. Those questions could be answered directly at the conclusion of the case by the administrator or personnel within the agency in a review. I know there's citizen oversight committees and things of that nature. But back to your question, sir, I think that you're always subject to scrutiny of the actions that you are taking, and there should never be a blanket protection that if you are investigated for one particular area of the law, it exonerates you from any and all behavior that was conducted by the officer.
Thank you very much. Go ahead.
As I travel the country and talk with our members, they consistently talk about the fact that they don't see any accountability when police officers harm or hurt someone, particularly of color. And that is borne out by a set of experiences that people have every single day. They are the conversations that happen in Black communities around the kitchen table, within our churches, within our barbershops, within our beauty salons. And it is important that as we have these conversations, we truly understand the conversations that are happening inside of communities. The communities are not looking for public relations. They do call law enforcement when they need them. They have members of their family who are part of law enforcement. They, they turn out and vote in elections where law enforcement are up for election. What they want is for there to be a set of accountability, for law enforcement officials to have the same type of accountability that they have at their workplaces, that when something is done wrong, that there will be an investigation, that there will be some transparency, and that the community will understand sort of what the path forward is. And time again, the community simply has no faith in that. And so when we get to a set of accountability, a system that the community can trust, there might be conversations around ride-alongs or other things that can be done that can build greater trust or greater opportunity for young people to see law enforcement as a potential career. But we have to have a conversation about accountability. That's what the community needs right now, and that's what this moment requires.
Thank you very much. Roberto Villasenor, followed by Connie Rice, and our time is limited now, so I'd ask everyone to have concise questions and answers as possible.
I have, with that being said, I'm sorry, I have two questions I'd like to ask. First to Mr. Robinson, you say in your statements and your testimony that broken windows is a failed policing concept. I'd like to know what empirical data you present to support that. I know in your footnotes you refer to a stop and frisk report. Do you equate them in the same? I'm not familiar with that report. I'm not sure if it talks about broken windows. So I'd like to know about that. And the second part of that is that often crime is much more prevalent, or we hear about it more in lower socioeconomic communities, which also unfortunately often are the communities of color. And so police are called into those areas much more frequently, which builds to many more frequent contacts and the potential for adversarial type of contacts. How do we overcome that and try and develop that trust and accountability that you're talking about and establish relationships so we can deal with those problems?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your question. And I would like to start by just talking about empirical data, because I think that that's a loaded phrase that I'd like to just push back on, the idea that, that the data simply, that when we talk about what broken windows has led to, we're just simply talking about sort of whether or not we have indications that crime is down in some sort of ways from big data perspective, and not looking actually at the full range of harms that these type of policies have on communities, have on sort of educational opportunities, have on sort of our system of mass incarceration in a country that incarcerates well more percentage-wise than its share of the world's population, and the economic impact that it has on Black and brown communities. So when we at Color of Change talk about the failed policies, and I did cite a report around stop and frisk, particularly because we do look at stop and frisk as an element of broken windows policing, as this concept that you're going out into certain communities, or you're going out into communities in general, and you are sort of targeting people with this idea that they, for low-level crimes, and with the idea that they are going to be potentially, if you do that, then you're stopping other crimes, especially in a place like New York, where we have seen decriminalization of marijuana, and stop and frisk was really targeting marijuana. So we look at that report around stop and frisk as a clear example of the failure of broken windows policing. The impact of the misdemeanors, and then the sort of upgrade from misdemeanors that broken windows policing continues to have in communities like New York and around the country, the impact that it's had on the lives of Black and brown people, the impact it's had on mass incarceration, has been a failed policy for this country, and it's been a failure of our justice system and our criminal justice system. In terms of how do we bring our communities together, how do we find ways that folks can trust one another? I live in New York City. I live in Harlem, in New York, and I travel down to our office in Midtown every day, and I go down the Upper West Side. And the statistic after statistic shows that the use of drugs is really no different between white kids and Black kids. But on my way to work, I will see the police interactions between young Black and brown kids, and police interaction with young white kids on their way to school. And it is a completely sort of different way of being, a different way for these young people to have to show up every day. We continue to see reports in communities in Brooklyn and New York City of football coaches telling their kids that, carry your helmet on the outside when you go home so the police know that you're a good kid. That's the life and the experience for so many Black and brown young people in our communities all around the country, not just in New York. And so when I talk about how Broken Windows has failed, or when we think about what we're going to have to do to bring our communities together, we are going to have to look at different ways of policing our communities, different ways of solving crime, and the ways in which we are conducting this in our communities right now, going after the most vulnerable, going after those with the least amount of power, and filling our jails and our prisons with those people hasn't made us any better, any stronger as a nation.
Okay. And I'm sorry, the second part was real quick towards Mr. McHale. You talk about education, and I wholeheartedly agree with you about getting representation from all facets of the community, and if we have entry-level requirements of a degree before getting in there. Does your membership, or how would they feel about requirements for obtaining a degree upon promotion in order to maintain that promotion? Something we do in our agency. It doesn't hold you back from testing, but once you achieve the rank, you have a certain amount of time to achieve a corresponding degree, and that's a way that we instill education throughout the ranks of our agency. Would that be something you'd see viable?
Yes. Again, it's on a department by department issue how either you have a collective bargaining agreement or the lack thereof. I clearly don't want to minimize the ability of one to obtain education. My concern is there are thousands upon thousands of individuals that are not getting the opportunity because we are basing the entry-level requirements of having that education. We have started to observe it loosening the belt, so to speak, whereas we're recognizing military experience as an equivalent. But there are many, many individuals that have life experience. They may have become a mother or father early on in their age, and they're providing for their family. And if they're not sponsored to a police academy, I could speak directly the state of Florida. Many of the individuals have to sponsor themselves. They receive their statewide certification, then they shop themselves throughout the state to obtain employment. So that is the concern. I embrace the opportunity to visit in the future the education requirements, but I just think that we're missing a large members of the population by having minimal requirements necessary. Upon entering into the profession, yes, I could see the establishment of certain levels of education, especially in those agencies that have the ability to provide assistance to obtain that education. Then you'll have a perfect combination of job, life experience, and proper education to perform your duties.
Thank you very much. Connie Rice.
Thank you, Chief Ramsey, and thank you to the panel for your testimony this morning. I think it's very, very helpful. I have a real quick question, which is that could each of you list at least 3 departments that are well on their way to establishing public trust policing with their communities and who seem to get it that they have to have the community with them to do proper policing? And then second, could you list, well, you're probably not going to do this, you're going to refuse to do this, but I'd like to know if you could point to some communities we ought to look to that need a lot of help. You're probably not going to list that. But I think you could list the first set of, which is a police department that understands it must have the community with it and that it has to get close to the community in order to get a mandate for trust. I think you can think of some of those, and what are those departments and why should we be looking at them?
As quickly as possible. We're running short on time.
Well, let me start with 2. And Charlotte Mecklenburg, and I think we've got some representation from that department here today. I've worked with them. They've been our research partners for a number of years in different projects. They get it, and they've gotten it over. It's not, I mean, the chief comes and goes, but the department gets it. Marietta, Georgia, I think under the leadership of Dan Flynn, they get it. And reading their reports, doing some of the things we've done with them, they understand what you're asking. And I guess you wanted a third, I'll give you Austin, Texas. Chief Acevedo has done a remarkable job of getting the community support, and they've partnered with us on several research projects and have been very forthcoming.
Is there a reason you don't list LA?
I haven't done work in LA for so long that I just don't know it well.
Okay, thank you.
Ma'am, City of Sarasota, the City of Sarasota has commenced to utilizing the ability to bring in college students. We have a Blue Plus You campaign that is going on right now, where we had college students come in and review the policies, procedures of the agency. They've created a website. We're on social media on a daily basis, good, bad, or indifferent. We're reporting directly from the scene of incidents, inviting the public to participate. We've had probably 5 citizen academies within the last 2 years. We're trying to do it on a quarterly basis. We're encouraging many men and women of the community to come into play. We are interacting at all levels, police officers, sergeants, lieutenants, captains, and administration in getting more involved in the community, and not just getting involved as a Little League coach or or a mentor, but we have big brothers, big sisters. Mirrored by that is our Sarasota County Sheriff's Department. We worked hand in hand with one another, again, to reach into the community, be more open to the community, and allow the community to come in. And the closest city to us is the city of Tampa. They have done an excellent job as well of reaching out into the community, ensuring more community involvement, and opening itself up to review.
Thank you.
Very quickly, Charlotte Mecklenburg Police. And then I would like to say my department, Fayetteville PD, but we're very, very, very early in the process. We're Fayetteville, North Carolina Police Department.
Mr. Robinson.
I've certainly had the privilege of sitting with a number of police chiefs in different forums and having conversations about where they are going and trying to take their departments. I'm not in a position to highlight any department as a best practice at this point. I think what I'd like to really concentrate is on the set of federal policies that we need to be putting in place across the board, the set of federal standards that need to be put across the board to start moving us in the right direction. But I do want to say that there are a number of folks that I have sat in the room with and listened to, including the police chief in this city, who have put out a real vision for where they want to take their department and what they want to do with it. And and we stand ready to work with anyone who wants to work with us.
I notice none of you have any big cities in your lists. Is there a reason?
Charlotte.
Charlotte's not big.
Charlotte
New
Mecklenburg.
York's big and LA is big, but Charlotte ain't big.
We're going to have to really, really tighten this up, so.
I was just going to say, there are over 17,000 departments. I only know well the ones we work with, so it's hard to pick and choose.
All right, well, I want to thank all of you for your testimony very much. Thank you very much. It was very nice and very good.